Lauren's Galaxy is a podcast which is a collection of intriguing ideas about science, real life, and everything in between. My name is Lauren Panescu, and I'm the host of Lauren's Galaxy podcast. And today we're speaking with Dr. Shannon Nangle from Harvard University, who's working on creating a new bioplastics.
My name is Shannon Nangle. I'm a postdoc in the Silver Lab, which is at Harvard Medical School, and I'm going into my second year here.
So today we're going to talk about what you and your team are building. I assume it's your team.
Yes, my minions.
Excellent. Bacteria that produces plastic.
Yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about that? Just high level.
Of course. Yes. So it is a kind of bioplastic. It's not exactly the same chemical as polyethylene or polypropylene, which are the commonly used plastics today. It's a polymer made out of fatty acids. So it's a polyester of short to medium chain fatty acids, and it can be engineered to have particular properties. And we are trying to emulate the properties of petrochemical plastics through synthetic biology. And the twist here is that we're actually using CO2 and water as the sole carbon source and the sole energy source for these bacteria. And so in an effort to help promote a transition away from petrochemical plastics into biodegradable, compostable, eco-friendly, safe bioplastics, we want to use the cheapest materials available, raw materials, to make that transition more attractive.
So I kind of want to back up a little bit. So first of all, why plastic? Why are you using bacteria to make plastic in the first place?
First reason is my sole purpose in life is to develop technologies that can facilitate human life on other planets. I joined this lab specifically to learn synthetic biology and figure out the problems, the field, what's going on, what are the possibilities of supporting human life on other planets. And so there was a project in the Silver Lab called the Bionic Leaf, and when I joined, they recently submitted their paper to Science, and it was a device that could use the hydrogen-produced water-splitting electrodes in the same reaction vessel as the growing bacteria. And they determined that the polymer that these bacteria are known to make is the most efficient product in this system. So it has a energy to product conversion efficiency of about 42%. And so these bacteria, they're called Ralstonia eutropha or Cuprivitis nicator, just fill up their cells with this polymer. They can fill up to about 90% of their dry cell weight. So we're not even talking about like concentrations when we deal with this compound. We're talking about how much of the cell is our product, which is a big difference to a lot of the other niche products that are made through fermentation and bioproduction. The reason that we're doing plastics is one, the system is sort of set up for large production, or the potential for large production of these polymers, and it's also a good replacement product for just moving forward on Earth and in space, because we see this need for rapid prototyping and for in situ resource utilization that will be essential for human colonization. And so the plastics we see as, one, because it's the best product we can make with our system, and two, it conveniently will be a highly desirable product, specifically on Mars and hopefully on Earth.
I'm glad you mentioned Earth, because I did want to talk a little bit about bioplastic versus our standard plastics that we see every day.
Right.
And our plastics that we see every day are usually petroleum based. Is that right?
That's
So we're
correct.
using fossil fuels in our plastic.
Yes. Yep. 99% of all plastics that we use on Earth are derived from fossil fuels. But what's shocking is that only is 4% of total global oil use. Of all of the plastic that we have, that represents only 4% of the fossil fuels. So even eliminating all petrochemical plastics, we're still dealing with 96% of other things, which is primarily fuel requiring fossil fuels. So it will make a dent, but it's still quite a hurdle to become energy independent and not rely on fossil fuels. The good news is, as far as we know, there are no dinosaur fossils on Mars, and so we don't have to compete with the fossil fuel industry.
Well, that's good. There's no competition. But
Right.
then also, because it's not available, this would really be the only resource to use for plastic, your technology.
It wouldn't be the only one. I would advocate that it would be one of them, but we can use chemical methods to make ethylene and then which would turn into polyethylene or PET. The core problem with Mars, the raw materials are water and CO2, basically. Those are the most abundant raw materials we have other than dirt. And so in order to base a life support system off of existing Martian resources, we have to choose products that can be transformed into the materials we need from those raw resources. And so bacteria and biology is extremely well suited for transforming simple raw materials into complex compounds. While there do exist chemical methods for transformation, we're still limited by the weight, payload costs of these devices, and operational costs. Whereas with biology, you are not limited by payload, and you're not limited by taking everything you need at the beginning. So this kind of goes back to rapid prototyping and on-demand materials, which would simply entail a lab on Earth figuring out some product that those on Mars would need, doing all of the testing on the ground, and then sending the DNA electronically to the colonists on Mars, and then they are able to now make that product. So the payload, it kind of exits the equation in many of these cases. As long as you have the chassis available to you on Mars, you can live off the land via electronic messages containing DNA sequences. Biotechnology is currently our only answer for establishing a colony because of this strength. And you're reproducing your catalyst. So life replicates and maintains its own chemical processes. So you don't have to replace parts, or you don't have to,
So it's renewable on its own.
Right, that's right.
I find it interesting that you use terms like chassis, because I mean, as an aerospace engineer, I think of like chassis being this big giant mechanical thing, but it applies to biology as well. It's cool.
Yeah, so one of the dreams of synthetic biology is that you have, and we do call them chassis, so that your industrial producing organism is just the host, the machinery to make your product of interest. Ideally, compound agnostic. You just have your synthesis pathway in your chassis delivers that to you.
So it seems like every time I hear about a bioengineering project, it's using bacteria.
Yep.
Why is that? Is bacteria different? I mean, how is bacteria different than other microorganisms?
So the two most commonly used industrial producers are E. coli, which is a bacterium, and Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is a yeast. So yeast is also heavily used in industry. And we are using a completely weird, different kind of bacteria called Ralstonia, and it is not really at the scale of the industrial producers that E. coli and yeast are. So one benefit of using these microbes is that they have a very fast doubling time. So they can grow quickly, and they can grow to very high densities. And they're also very genetically tractable. So we have a lot of tools. Since the beginning of molecular biology, we have a lot of tools in place to engineer these guys, and in reliable ways. So basically, they are the tractable organisms, because so much work has gone into understanding their metabolism and how different expression strategies will work. And it's just kind of, part of it is just a founder effect, where, well, we started with E. coli and now we're stuck with E. coli. But it does also have to do with the doubling times and the densities that these bacteria can grow with.
Okay, so it seems like they're a little relatively easier to manipulate and control, and we know more about it, and they grow really fast. So that's, yes. Okay, cool. That makes sense. Something I found interesting is that, okay, so you can use CO2 in water, and I noticed that you're using CO2 from the atmosphere as opposed to concentrated CO2. How do you even?
Either one. Yeah,
either one. Okay.
In the lab, we just use a canister from air gas of CO2 and pump it in. But in a scaled up version of the bioreactor, we would ideally use waste gases. So this is called syngas. Cool. It's the gas is produced by many fossil fuel plants. And there are gas fermenters that are specifically designed to distribute gas to the organisms. It's still a great challenge. Scale up in general for industrial production with bacteria or any microbe is non-intuitive and non-linear. So even if you have a great bug in the lab, there's no guarantee that you'll be able to scale that up to a production relevant scale. And so with the gas fermenters, we will have to tweak that basic design to really fit with our specific organism. And you have this kind of synergistic cooperation between how the fermenter itself is built and what that bacteria require out of that fermenter. So there's some mutual combination of characteristics that you need to fine tune and develop, and that takes a lot of like chemical engineering as well as biological engineering to get that fit really efficient. And
can you briefly explain exactly what a fermenter is? Part of the
yes.
process in there.
Right. So basically a fermenter is a vat that contains a liquid culture of bacteria, and the bacteria is flowed through the vessel in various ways. So you can actually move the whole culture in sort of a continuous flow, or you can use a propeller to disrupt any sedimentation that may occur. So just kind of always keep the bacteria in suspension. So it's just a large vessel that shakes up bacteria, but it becomes very complicated when you want to start delivering compounds to the culture, especially if it's gas, because now you're dealing with solubility limits, you're dealing with diffusion, and that can lead to a lot of complexities during the scale-up process. But it's basically just a big vat.
And your papers referenced a non-plant source of carbon. Can you talk a little about those comparisons between plant-based and silicon-based?
In the context of the original bionic leaf that was published a few years ago, there was discussion of basically how the bionic leaf is artificial photosynthesis, which means that we've deconstructed photosynthesis into separate divisions, and each division is optimized sort of independently. So rather than using photosystem 2 in the plant's leaves, we're using photovoltaics, which have a much larger availability for wavelengths. And then instead of using, again, photosystem 2 for water splitting, we're using specifically designed electrodes to split water in a biocompatible environment. And then, like plants, we're using the Calvin cycle inside of bacteria to fix carbon and make it into our compound of choice. And so by deconstructing photosynthesis in these ways, we can optimize the energy efficiencies. So whereas terrestrial plants have solar to biomass conversion efficiency of 1%, we can get around 10%. And so it's a modest progression and kind of proof of principle that we can kind of use the properties, the principles from nature, but optimize them in specific ways by separating them out into specific devices.
Right. So you can control and tweak and improve the efficiencies of...
In a modular way, right.
Okay, yeah. And this is the feedstock, so it would be, you have your microbe, your bacteria over here, the feedstock over here, and they produce...
The feedstock is CO2. So the sole carbon source is CO2. One project that we're working on is engineering our bacteria to make feedstocks for heterotrophs. So those microbes that I mentioned earlier, your yeasts, your E. coli's, to still have them as the industrial producer, as the chassis for all of our products. But instead of getting the feedstock from plants in the form of sugar, like from sugar cane or from sugar beets, the traditional ways of getting glucose and sucrose to industrial heterotrophs, we will replace that whole huge processing step by basically like a one-pot CO2 to sucrose reaction in our bacteria to then grow the heterotrophs either in the same fermenter. That can get kind of complicated, or we can simply filter out the media that the initial bacteria that were fixing CO2 to make sucrose are in, and feeding that directly to the heterotrophs. So we've eliminated a huge expensive part of operating costs for fermentation, and hopefully that will open up the space to use these industrial heterotrophs for more products. Because currently the biggest problem is that in metabolic engineering and bioproduction is that it's so expensive. Operation is so expensive, and most of that is from feedstock costs. And if we're using CO2, you can greatly decrease those costs. And by decreasing the costs, not only will be more competitive in the existing spaces, but it would open up new opportunities for production. So in our case, it could be biopolymers would be an example where right now, because petrochemical plastics are so cheap, we just can't hope to compete at that scale. But if we're able to drive down the costs by changing the feedstock or using another organism that makes another polymer, which otherwise wouldn't be able to be competitive with the current bioproduction, we could have even more space for bioproduced products.
Okay. And how does the cost of bioplastic compare to petroleum plastic?
Yeah, so there are a couple different kinds. The main bioplastic is called PLA, polylactic acid, and that's usually what's in the cups that you get at like eco-friendly restaurants, or some of the packaging that are from somewhat more eco-conscious companies. That is made from lactic acid and polymerized industrially. The complication, though, is that it's not compostable in the sense of you can throw it on the ground and it will disappear. You actually have to bring it to specific digesters in rich nutrient conditions. So this would be like food waste, for example. And then farms would buy that as compost. So PLA, while not the worst, is not a long-term solution because of both the industrial polymerization that is required, which uses fossil fuels, and that it's not fully biodegradable. And so that cost there is about 3 times as much as petrochemical, like recyclable petrochemical plastics, at about 90 cents a pound. And we are using PHA, which is a polyhydroxyalkanoate, which currently is $2.50 a pound. And we think with our system, with the reduced feedstock costs by using CO2, that we can maybe get around the same as PLA. And so while we are still very much in the lab stage, the feedstock costs are significant enough for it to make sense. The big challenge here is that petrochemical plastics are so cheap, and bioplastics are still not really taking off, even though the infrastructure is compatible with both petrochemical plastics and bioplastics. So you don't actually need to restructure the whole plastic processing pipeline to use these bioplastics. We're specifically engineering them to be as drop-in like as possible, but it's still not really, it doesn't economically make sense yet.
Okay, so there's a lot there I want to branch out on.
Yep.
So it's interesting that your plastic, you're saying it's kind of interchangeable. By the infrastructure, you mean like the whole process of the plastic production industry, and what you're creating here can fit in there seamlessly, almost.
Almost seamlessly, yeah.
Almost.
So the goal is to engineer them to be as seamless as possible. So they can be 3D printed, they can be injection molded, they can be machined. So all of the properties that are desirable with petrochemical plastics, we're trying to reproduce with this new polymer.
Okay, great. And then you said you're still in the lab, so technical readiness level of like 3 or
like 2 or 3. Yep.
2 or
Yep.
3.
We have a few little scaled up models. The main goal at the moment in the short term is basically to engineer constructs that are most efficient. So we're not quite at the stage of looking at, well, how do we increase the density in the bioreactor? How do we deliver the gases in the bioreactor? How do we process these things? We're kind of still at, okay, what promoter is best? Like what kind of plasmid is best? Should we do genomic integration? Should we put this gene in front of the other gene? Like what, basically still at the genetic engineering stage of development, but have proof of concept for a variety of compounds.
Okay. So if I were to ask about the energy required to produce these bioplastics as compared to petroleum plastics, is it a little too early to state? Or?
Yep, that's
okay.
A very difficult problem. So the techno-economic analysis is an ongoing effort in our system, mainly because we don't have a bioreactor to derive the numbers from. We're mainly just kind of going off of the efficiencies of the different pathways in the cell. But in terms of like getting a number for how much does this unit of hydrogen cost to make X volume of product over time versus a like sugar-based feedstock, we don't know. We're still working on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. I was surprised to find the use of electricity in these systems. So it's like bioelectrical chemical. So it seems like almost 3 different fields kind of coming together to produce this. Is that about right?
Yeah, so for the bionic leaf, so they're kind of 2 different projects. There's the bionic leaf, which is the device that integrates water splitting electrodes with a culture. And then there's what I'm currently doing, which is engineering those bacteria to make various compounds. We're not necessarily focusing on those electrodes, so that's where the electrochemical part comes in. We're mainly just focusing on how do we engineer these bacteria, and then we can think about how to deliver the hydrogen to them later. The water splitting electrodes are just to give them hydrogen. And we're still just kind of thinking about best ways to deliver all of the consumables. But the point there that you brought up that is important is that the answer, especially for Mars, to a lot of these questions and challenges will require extremely interdisciplinary solutions. So kind of taking key technologies that are reliable and well understood and efficient and modular to interface with other technologies to make the whole system a sustainable life support loop, where you can recycle everything, you have high efficiency use, you have a kind of a whole interconnected ecosystem of engineering, biology, chemistry, technologies like these that can kind of connect many different fields and give a product or a solution that can work in extreme limited environments.
Right. So working together and making friends with all kinds of different
Yeah.
This is very important.
Yep.
That's cool. That's good. I'm glad you mentioned 3D printing because, of course, going to Mars, it seems like what could theoretically happen is you have these bacteria creating bioplastics that can then be processed into 3D printing filaments, and then you have a printer. And so in space, you can just go from basically have your whole setup there. Is that?
Yep.
That sounds so cool.
Yes, hopefully it works perfectly every time.
Every time. Or
Yeah.
at least most of the time.
Yeah.
All right. So I was going to ask if this whole system could be sent to Mars, and it sounds like that's why you're doing this.
Yes, that is why. I don't know if it is the best system to be used on Mars. It's mainly a toy system that I am using to explore the challenges and nuances of in situ resource utilization, which is NASA's term for living off the land. And so yeah, basically that's my motivation. That's kind of what helps me adjust for what products are most interesting and which products we should pursue. And I actually truly believe that synthetic biology and biotechnology will be essential for having a long-term human presence on Mars.
Oh, very cool. And then, I mean, you're putting on all this work for these, for the bioplastic. We can surely use that here as well. Could help our current environment.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit.
Yes. Yeah. So as everyone is probably aware, we are quickly reaching catastrophic levels of plastic pollution. And although plastic only use 4% of fossil fuels, they are causing significant environmental damage to the planet, specifically the ocean. There'll be about 12 billion tons of plastic in the landfills and in the world by 2050. We're currently producing like 300 million tons of plastic a year. While, you can always try to appeal to people's empathy when you show how impactful and destructive plastics are to marine life, that may not be enough to convince people to change their habits. But we basically lose about $13 billion a year based on this environmental destruction. It's not just killing cute sea turtles, it's having a serious impact on how we use the world and how we use the oceans as an economic foundation.
Just thinking that because you're producing this bioplastic and the numbers are pretty bad as far as the environment, maybe some environmentally focused organizations could work with your team to try to help replace or reduce plastic pollution in the world. What do you think about that?
Basically, while we are still early stage, we are very interested in knowing who potential customers would be, and we would just be producing the resin. Like, we would be the first step in the supply chain, and they can decide what they want to do with it. But we would basically need an idea of where the pain points are, who the customers could be, to really provide that product to them. And environmental organizations would probably be aware of at least the worst actors, and then try to replace those. Or it could just be one of the more prevalent petrochemical plastics that could be replaced and that has the easiest chance of being integrated in the existing infrastructure. Going back to the earlier question about the cost of these things, while it may be more expensive, having regulatory pressure to not buy the competitor conveniently helps those who are trying to make a more sustainable product. So it's another force coming in that will manipulate the market to hopefully favor more environmentally friendly compounds.
Okay. And as far as next steps, would this be your next step to find those direction that the market or that the society would prefer? Or do you have other next steps?
Yeah, basically, we're in an information acquisition stage of figuring out who needs what to guide our experiments. Because at the moment, we've just kind of done what's worked. Now that we know that that proof of principle is there, we would move into directions into which people would actually want the thing we're making. So figuring out what those are. Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of like you've designed this awesome tech, and now you're like, okay, world, we have it. Who wants it? Who wants to
well, more like, what do you recommend we do with it?
All right, cool. What was your background? How did you, I know you got into this for Mars, but what was your background? What did you have to study to get started on this?
Well, in undergrad, I started out as a neuroscience major, and then determined that the field was not quite objective enough, and moved into the most human-removed biological science, which is structure biology, because I couldn't deal with having my own personal interpretation influence the results and influence the meaning. And so even though that's still, it's inescapable, I wanted some more firm grounding. And so structure biology is kind of at the triple point of biology, chemistry, and physics. And you have to understand all of those to kind of understand what's going on in the protein in the cell. Unfortunately, no one really cares about that. And in order to make any kind of impact, and specifically make an impact in the direction of human spaceflight, I would need to get into a more practical biological field. And thinking about all of the potential options, synthetic biology is the most applied. It's the most engineering geared biological science. So that was the path of my academic life.
Did you ever think you would be working in a lab developing plastics that could save the world?
I still don't think that.
Okay.
But
or save Mars.
Yeah, space has always been an inspiration and a goal of mine since really learning about what science is as a youth, and it's all kind of centered around human experience. So this might get into kind of fringe philosophizing, but basically I the reason I think that human spaceflight should be a priority, not only because it's awesome, but because I believe in giving the opportunity to more people to live and to experience. And so we can't have more people on Earth for very much longer. So by expanding our scope and the locations in which humans can live, we will be giving more people the chance to live, which I think is a good thing. And then more abstractly than just having more people experience the world and the universe, as far as we know as conscious creatures, that can assign meaning to the world, to the universe. And so without consciousness, the universe may well not exist, because there is no understanding or experience of it. So I see the opportunity to facilitate life and to facilitate consciousness as a way to generate meaning itself. Also, just like really sad if humans don't ever leave Earth. Like,
yes. I know. Like, can you imagine like never seeing what's out there?
Yeah, this is the end. This is it.
Sad.
Yep.
I'm glad you mentioned population, because that's something that I'm not sure, I don't hear about as often as I thought I would. It's about how there is a limit to how population that our planet can sustain.
Yep.
And population is growing exponentially, so we're getting there.
Yeah, I think that the limit of I don't actually know the parameters and how they determine what the resource limit is for humans, but somewhere around 9 to 10 billion is like the carrying capacity for I think so. I don't know.
So we're basically there.
We're almost there. Yep.
Or if we're not, we will be like in a year or two.
A couple of years. Yeah.
You know, of course, we met at New Space Conference, so of course, space is a big deal to both of us. But every time I talk to someone who's maybe outside of this space,
yeah.
There's always the question or the comment usually about why should we, you know, try to go to another planet when we have so many problems here? And I'm sure you get frustrated like I do.
Yes. You probably deal with it with fewer eye rolls than I do, but
try.
What is your general response?
I mean, but a lot of times I think that a lot of the solutions, there's so many answers, I think. For one thing, a lot of the solutions to our current problems will be developed while trying to get off planet, like kind of bioplastics, where we can't use fossil fuel. I mean, there's one.
Yep.
I also think agriculture is one. If we can create a biosphere that works and create an entire ecosystem that's completely independent, then we should understand enough to be able to fix our own here. So
yep.
like there's that one. I think water insecurity around the world. I mean, if we can figure out how to solve that problem on Mars, then we can figure that out here. Although they just said they found water on Mars.
They did. It's amazing. I can't even, I'm still like, I get goosebumps. Like it's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't caught up on all the readings. I just saw the headline. I was like, oh my gosh. So there's water on Mars. I believe subterraneously.
Yep.
I don't know how much though.
Yeah. Subsurface is about 20 kilometers of liquid water, which vague calculations of salinity would be like 40%. So it still would be quite salty to exist in liquid form at those pressures, even though it's subsurface. But that is it's way easier to process liquid water than ice. And if it's on site, I mean, not that I actually don't know what the current technologies we have in mind for processing water are on Mars, but having liquid water at least won't require us to heat it up, which takes
we take one step out of the way.
Right.
Yeah.
But going back to your earlier comments about what space technologies can do for Earth, and kind of confronting the cynicism or skepticism of people who don't believe that space is relevant, is that you basically have to solve every problem on Earth, but better for space. So if you
like that.
So if you can do that, you can translate that back to Earth, because the constraints are vastly greater in space or on Mars, and so having technologies that work reliably, that work with the limited resources, can definitely translate to Earth-based problems. And this may not even be limited to technology. We'll have to develop new social structures, new governments, new priorities, and organizations of how government interfaces with corporations. And like all of these challenges are relevant for both Earth and not Earth. And hopefully we'll sort of be able to break free of some of the ingrained systems that are at play on Earth, and rebuild them on Mars. This is kind of like the really utopic outlook that Kim Stanley Robinson outlined in his Mars trilogy books, where it's basically, let's break free of the Earth systems that are no longer useful, and try to rebuild something with better, with human interests more at heart.
I like that. I like that a lot. Yeah, that would be, yeah.
and we're also never going to run out of problems. Like, there's never going to be a time where we're like, oh, I think we're good here, let's try Mars.
Yeah, that'll never happen.
No. And so
and that's never happened in history. You know, people didn't leave because things were great at home.
Yeah.
They usually explored because they wanted to see something new or get away from something, or I don't know. There's a lot of reasons. There
are a lot of reasons, and so, like, not only will exploring new technologies and new ways of life for space exploration help the Earth, the sooner we get started on this, the better answers we'll have when they become more essential. Yeah. So while we may not be under extreme pressure to figure out solutions for space travel, we have the time to get a better approximation, to get a better solution. And so rather than what we're doing with climate change, where we're not really grasping the pressure that we're under, hopefully we won't have the same kind of existential pressure to figure out how to escape Earth, and that Earth will still be fine and functioning and the cradle of humans. But yeah, I mean, we can't wait until there's an unequivocal reason to develop these technologies, because they take a long time.
Exactly.
It's decades. It's like centuries. It's gonna be a trek.
Yeah. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because people they don't see the urgency, but I think the urgency is here because of what you just said. Like, there's so many things to figure out. We're talking about an entirely different space with an entirely different, environment on so many levels, on every level. And then every single thing has to be figured out, and there's so many things to figure out and to perfect, and especially to make it safe enough for travel to be commonplace. That requires a certain level of maturity. So there's so much to do that even if it was like, oh, we don't have to worry for another 50 years, like that's no time at all.
Right.
We're running out of time.
Yep.
Because there's so much to do. So there's a lot more flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
You know, if we see the urgency, and if we can go ahead and maneuver ourselves to accomplish and solve these problems, and then we're not depending on the political climate.
Yep.
I think that's the challenge.
Yep.
And then as far as the time scale, you know, businesses don't always think about it in terms of generations either. I mean, usually they're on a pretty short time scale too. And so on the one hand, you could say that governments should be the ones focusing on that, but they don't.
Mm-hmm.
So then it's kind of left up to
the billionaires.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of the situation we're stuck in at the moment. The strength of having billionaires take on these challenges is because they have that flexibility, they have the money, and they can kind of, unfortunately, because there's a very narrow bottleneck into who makes the calls of what to do as the leader of that particular company, they at least are not constrained by the commonplace governmental habits of kind of wanting to integrate everything. Like one problem with the Mars program or the moon or current lunar programs is that everyone wants their particular project integrated into that program. And so there's a lot of kind of just diplomatic, bureaucratic bloat that tries to make everyone happy, but may not actually be what is the best answer for the problem. And whereas companies have more flexibility to get that best answer because there are fewer people who can make that final call. And yeah, so the billionaires kind of have the time and money. It's the question of how do we then deal with social problems or government challenges of the people who are actually on that planetary body. We have no idea.
And that's a challenge as well. I think it's a challenge that the entire commercial space industry is struggling with, because it's still business, right? If it's business, then there has to be a customer, there has to be a business plan, there has to be a way to generate revenue.
Yep.
Just to keep the lights on and keep going. It's not even about trying to make it rich right now. It's just about making sure you have funding for next year. Yep. And so then where does that's where the whole space application, but bringing it back to Earth so that it can be useful here is very necessary. It's not really just like a charitable sort of thing. It's also, it just makes sense to have.
Yeah.
I don't know, but it's a challenge because how do we do that for every major project? Yeah,
I mean, these are questions that I hope we will be asking for the next 50 years before we actually send people. My one worry is that we'll just kind of be impatient and send people out with kind of vague plans for how they're supposed to organize, and then that failing so spectacularly that it's lost public interest or public support, or people are no longer confident that we can do this, or that it would make sense. And so I think it requires a lot of hard thinking at the front end to kind of make sure that we'll do it correctly on the human side, on the social side, not just like, are we going to get the technology right? Are we going to get the whole community right? The whole interpersonal interactions right? I mean, is it going to be a science mission? Is it going to be a scouting mission for companies? Like, and at what way, and when does it transfer to other governments, or how do we make this internet? I mean, like, these are just like
A lot.
so many
So many things.
so many things.
Do you think your technology plays into the social side of these questions at all?
Oh gosh, no.
Okay, not at all. This is purely the technological, because we see how technology influences society, or sometimes.
Yeah, this I hope will just kind of fulfill a purely utilitarian need, and that it won't introduce biases towards any particular way of living or making decisions for the humans themselves, that it would be able to actually do what they want it to do, rather than be constrained to how it works, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I get that. That's cool. So you would want it to be so useful that then people can take that and create whatever they wish to create.
Yeah, I mean, modularity and recyclability are the two great aspects of any technology that would be used for ISRU. So yeah,
Cool.
Basically just have the bacteria do your bidding and call it a day.
Do you have one last thing you'd like to say, like your final takeaway?
Just for people to start thinking about the introduction of biology in solving major problems, whether they're on Earth or on other planets, and that biotechnology has a great potential for being not only eco-friendly, but being extremely versatile and modular. And so basically moving towards a bio-based society and economy will be great for Earth and other planets, and that I still think that biotechnology is the only way to set up any kind of self-sufficient colony on other planets, particularly Mars. You need carbon. So the moon is a bit trickier.
Ah, interesting.
Yep.
Okay. Very cool. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Happy to chat, and thank you for inviting me.